I can still recall the initial instant I entered that residence. An ancient villa situated in a tranquil suburb, where the afternoon breeze whistled through the white curtains, transporting the essence of time and the memories that had resided within. The house was not new, but it possessed an enchanting beauty that was due to be revealed, much like a mystery. I felt as though I was entering an untold narrative as a result of the soaring ceiling, the classic wooden furniture, and the golden light that was dispersed across the cold ceramic tile floor. Daniel, my spouse, stood beside me, firmly grasping my hand. However, I could detect the haste in his every action. This residence was merely a transient halt for him. He was consistently associated with high-rise structures that were illuminated throughout the night, stressful meetings, and endless flights. For my part, I was uncertain as to where I belonged. Daniel observed me standing silently in front of the residence and remarked, "You will become accustomed to it. Your father is a kind individual, however, he is somewhat reserved. Is it quiet?" I peered at the man who was standing a few steps away from us. Mr. William Carter, Daniel's father, was perched against the door frame, his gaze fixed on me with an incomprehensible tranquility. A man who is 65 years old, yet still maintains the robust aspect of his youth. The wrinkles on his visage did not age him, rather, they underscored his experience. His eyes were deep and solemn, and his hair was streaked with silver. However, there was an enigmatic quality to them, something that caused me to tremble, not necessarily out of dread, but rather out of curiosity. Upon our initial encounter, he did not offer any commentary, rather he extended his hand to me. "All are welcome." The salutation was brief and lacked the enthusiasm of a father welcoming his new daughter-in-law. However, it was not particularly chilly. It was as though the sentence was burdened with an invisible force that I was unable to fully comprehend. This individual appeared to be concealing himself. A substantial amount. I believed that I would only be residing here for a brief period, as Daniel would ultimately relocate me to a more comfortable residence in a city where the streets were lively and the lights were perpetually on. However, I was mistaken. There was something about this home that impeded my progress. Or more precisely, an individual to whom I attempted to adjust during my initial residence in that residence. However, the more I endeavored, the more I came to the realization that there were certain things that were not readily embraced. The silence that enveloped everything. Daniel was perpetually preoccupied. He left the house early and only returned late at night, sometimes days later, when I could not even recall the last time we had actually sat down together. "I apologize. You are aware that the organization is currently engaged in a significant initiative, correct?" Despite my comprehension, the desolation that consumed me on a daily basis was not alleviated. In the expansive chamber adjacent to the frigid bed, I awakened each morning in solitude. I meandered through the extensive corridors, listening to the clocks chiming as a reminder of the oppressive silence that enveloped this facility. Although there were 3 individuals residing in this residence, only 2 of them were actually residing there. William was the sole individual I encountered on a daily basis. At first, I maintained a separation from him, not because he was antagonistic, but rather because there was something about him that caused me to be uncertain about how to act. He was not as severe as the fathers-in-laws in the stories I had heard. However, he was not the easiest person to deal with. He experienced loneliness in a unique manner, a form of isolation that had become ingrained in one's life. However, this led me to believe that I recognized myself in him. I recall the first time I engaged in a meaningful conversation with him. It was late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast. The sky was obscured by thick clouds. I was seated on the veranda, gazing impassively at the rear garden. "Today, precipitation is anticipated." His voice astonished me. He had been standing in that position for an extended period of time. Steam emanates from the cup of steaming coffee in one's hand. I turned to address him, endeavoring to induce a courteous smile. "Indeed, it appears to be the case. Are you feeling isolated?" he inquired without any preamble or introduction. I hesitated. I should have refuted it. I should have grinned, declared that I was in good health, that I was accustomed to it. However, I was unable to do so at that precise moment. I refrained from responding. However, it is possible that he was already aware of the answer. Beginning that day, we engaged in brief discussions. Although it is not extensive or profound, it is sufficient to bridge the voids. If I had previously sat alone at breakfast, he was now present. There was minimal conversation between us. However, even if he was merely sitting across from me, reading the newspaper and sipping coffee, his presence rendered the house less eerie. I began to pay closer attention to him. He meticulously pruned each flower branch in the backyard garden each morning as I observed. I observed the expression on his face as he gazed at the photograph of his wife. I came to the realization that the loneliness Daniel presented to me was entirely distinct from anything I had ever encountered when he gave me an expression that I had never seen before. Not the lonely kind of being which is left behind, but the lonely kind of having everything and then losing it. The most alarming aspect is that I am uncertain as to whether I am empathizing with him or recognizing a portion of myself in him. I am uncertain as to the precise moment at which the transformation occurred. Perhaps it was the mornings when I awoke and no longer felt entirely alone. Or perhaps it was the moments when I entered the kitchen and observed William had prepared coffee for us both, a steaming cup neatly set on the table, not out of obligation, but simply because he knew I enjoyed it. Or perhaps it was when I began to realize that I was paying more attention to him than I should have. At first, I convinced myself that it was merely a natural affection, that I was merely seeking a replacement for Daniel. However, there are certain matters that you cannot deceive yourself about indefinitely. Standing at the window, I observed him in the garden in the days that followed. He possessed an extraordinary amount of patience. Despite having endured so much, he still took the time to meticulously prune each branch and water each flower as if it were his entire universe. One day, I passed by and paused on the veranda to observe him at work. I exclaimed in awe at the beauty of this garden. Though his forehead was drenched in perspiration, his eyes were as serene as ever. He gazed upwards at me. It is the sole variable that I have the ability to regulate. That statement caused me to halt in my tracks. I am uncertain as to whether or not he comprehended the significance of the statement. However, I did. I comprehended the situation because I experienced the same emotions. When life appeared to be out of control and the environment around us was undergoing rapid change, individuals consistently attempted to grasp onto something in order to maintain their stability. Subsequent to that day, I began to frequent the garden more frequently. In the beginning, I remained a spectator, but I progressively acquired the ability to assist him with minor tasks. He instructed me on the proper method of pruning at the appropriate angle, the identification of a flower that was on the brink of blooming, and the proper treatment of the flower to ensure its optimal appearance. One afternoon, while I was struggling with my gardening equipment, he abruptly spoke. "Has Daniel disclosed any information regarding his mother?" I was taken aback by the inquiry and glanced up. He simply stated that she passed away when he was small. Mr. William's eyes stared into the horizon as he nodded. She was an exceptional woman. He paused, as if he were contemplating his remarks. However, there are instances in which one is unable to maintain possession of certain items regardless of the effort exerted. I was overcome with emotion by the sound of his voice. I was unsure of the reason, but I desired to convey to him that I comprehended the situation. I was also attempting to preserve an item that I was uncertain about its ownership, but I refrained from expressing my doubts. We continued to remain in that position, quietly conversing, allowing time to pass between the trees, the gentle breezes, and the objects that did not require any further explanation, but were still present. William and I progressively developed a stronger bond as a result of our informal conversations. Not in an overtly intimate manner, but rather through a gradual but haunting connection. I experienced a sense of security in his presence. I perceived myself as being acknowledged. Acknowledged. Something that I had not experienced in my marriage. There were evenings. When Daniel called to briefly discuss work and then rang up, I would proceed to the living room, where William frequently sat, reading in the soft yellow light. At one point, I abruptly inquired, "Do you experience feelings of isolation?" He placed the book down and gazed at me for an extended period. "Indeed." A straightforward response that does not conceal anything. However, it is possible that my pulse plummeted as a result of that candor. I am unsure of the reason, but I felt compelled to inform him that I was also feeling isolated. I desired for him to be aware that I comprehended the sensation. However, it was unnecessary for me to express it. I was aware that he comprehended the situation when he gazed at me at that precise moment. At that moment, I came to the realization that there was an element between us that I could no longer manage. Feared escalating. "Mr. William, I am not afraid of you, rather, I am fearful of myself." The emotions that I believed I could manage were gradually dissipating. I discovered that I eagerly anticipated the mornings when he placed a cup of coffee on the table. I discovered that I was attentive to his every movement as he traversed the home, waiting for the moments when we inadvertently encountered each other in the kitchen, the long hallway, or the shaded garden in the afternoon. I came to the realization that I enjoyed the peaceful moments we shared, when neither of us was required to express anything. However, I continued to experience an intensely direct connection that was nearly oppressive. Additionally, the most alarming aspect was that I was unwilling to cease. However, I was aware that this was incorrect. I am married. Daniel, the man I once adored, the individual whom I believed would provide me with the greatest degree of stability in my existence. However, I was also aware that there was an invisible barrier between Daniel and myself that we never acknowledged. He treated me well upon his return home, although it was an unconscious act of compassion, similar to a routine rather than a desire. Before departing, he briefly kissed me and inquired about my day. However, his gaze was perpetually fixed on the phone's display. He was perpetually preoccupied with his occupation. Daniel never truly gazed upon me. In contrast to the manner in which Mr. William regarded me, I endeavored to evade those notions. I immersed myself in household chores, cleaning the room, reorganizing all elements. However, I continued to perceive his gaze in my mind, regardless of my actions. Then one day, I resolved to venture outside, go for a solo stroll. I walked along the small path around town, allowing the wind to blow against my face in an effort to regain my equilibrium. I hoped that it would alleviate my mind of trivial notions. However, upon my return, Mr. William was present as I entered the residence. He was in the kitchen, holding a tumbler of wine, and his gaze was fixed on me. "What is the destination of your journey?" Despite its warmth, his voice was somewhat unintelligible. I replied that I was simply taking a walk and I could feel my heartbeat racing more rapidly than usual. "You appear to be distinct." I hesitated. Distinct? I was unaware of his intentions, however I could discern that he was perceiving me, observing what I was attempting to conceal. I experienced an increase in body temperature, not from the fire but from a source that is profoundly internal. I swiftly disregarded him and proceeded to the stairs at a rapid pace. However, I could sense it as soon as I passed him. His odor, the fragrance of sandalwood, a slight hint of cigarette smoke, something that is both captivating and masculine. At that instant, I was aware that I had lost my bearings. I endeavored to circumvent him in the days that followed. I was apprehensive about confronting my emotions. I was hesitant to acknowledge that I was anticipating an item that was not present. However, fate appeared to be unwilling to abandon me. Mr. William was observed gazing into the night through the window as I exited the living room to retrieve water late one evening. The face was illuminated by a dim light, which resulted in the formation of pointed lines that I had never previously observed. He turned to gaze at me. "Are you experiencing difficulty falling asleep?" I nodded, hesitated briefly, and then approached. "What about you, father?" He offered a feeble smile, one that was ambiguous in its intent. Older individuals frequently have an excessive number of items to recall. My heart was brimming with unspoken inquiries as I sat in the chair opposite him. "Emily, are you content?" The inquiry was abruptly delivered, causing me to freeze. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words emerged. I desired to convey my satisfaction. I desired to convey my affection for Daniel. I desired to convey that I had never experienced a sense of alienation in this residence. However, I was unable to do so. I was aware that William could see it in my gaze. We maintained eye contact for an extended period of time. We were both aware of a searing sensation between us, but neither of us dared to express it. However, it is a fact that suppressed entities have a propensity to erupt. I ought to cease. I am aware of that. I am aware that I should not allow these thoughts to dominate my consciousness or allow these emotions to persist. However, the heart is beyond the control of the intellect. And then the instant that signified the loss of control finally arrived. It was a dreary evening. The house was jolted by the powerful winds that the storm generated as it traversed the town. The living room was illuminated by flickering patches of light as lightning struck outside the windows, enveloping the area in an eerie glow. Daniel was absent from his residence. I was alone on the sofa, gazing at the screen of my phone. No calls, no messages. It had been 3 days since he had last contacted me. I made an effort to not allow it to affect me. However, I truly felt as though I had been abandoned. I rose from my seat and prepared to ascend the stairs, but then I heard footfall. I reversed my direction. Mr. Williams was situated at the conclusion of the hallway. The diffuse light cast his shadow on the floor. My heart began to beat more rapidly for reasons that remain unknown to me. He approached, but not too closely. He was sufficiently near for me to detect his robust presence. "Afraid?" he inquired with a subdued voice. I inhaled. "False," I responded, although I was uncertain as to whether it was accurate. Thunder resounded from the exterior. I was astonished and unconsciously retreated. The lights in the home were turned off at that precise moment. The room was enveloped in darkness. My respiration was held. The room abruptly became excessively silent. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the only sound I could hear was the rain striking the window. I then felt a gentle hand resting on my arm. I reversed my direction, astonished. Still, it was him. In the darkness, we stood in close proximity, neither of us speaking. I was startled by the proximity of his exhalation. A scent of sandalwood that was well known was detected. His body's warmth. Additionally, there is an additional item. Something that I was hesitant to identify. "Are you experiencing a chill?" His voice was gentle, resembling a murmur. I refrained from responding. I was unable to. It was pitch black inside the chamber. It was only illuminated by the lightning that was visible from the outside. At that moment, I experienced the sensation of the world around me dissolving. There was only him and me. The past is no longer relevant. There will be no more future. Only the present. A fleeting instant that persisted indefinitely. I am unaware of the individual who initiated the process. All I am aware of is that we were much too close. Excessively near. His heartbeat was as strong and rapid as mine, and I could sense it. A subtle gravitational force existed between us. An additional tempest. Not externally, but internally. I was aware that I should depart. I was aware that I should turn around and depart, allowing this moment to fade from my memory. However, I was unable to do so. It was then that I closed my eyes. I am uncertain as to what would have transpired had the lights in the house not been restored at that precise instant. The room was suddenly illuminated, causing me to reorient myself to the present. I retreated, inhaling deeply as if I were awakening from a surreal nightmare. "Mr. William concurred. Both of us gazed at one another. We did not exchange any words. However, I was aware. I was aware that we had crossed an invisible boundary. There was a change in the dynamic between us. It would never be the same again. Following that evening, I felt as though I had lost my identity. I endeavored to minimize my interactions with Mr. William. I did not visit the kitchen in the morning, the garden in the afternoon, or remain alone in the same area with him. However, despite my best efforts to avoid him, I could still detect his gaze whenever we unintentionally crossed paths. No one mentioned anything. However, the silence was more dreadful than any confession. It was an affirmation of the events that had transpired, of what ought not to have transpired. Daniel returned from a week of labor. He failed to observe my transformation. Or it is possible that he had never truly observed me for an extended period of time. During dinner, he announced, "I have some good news." His countenance was radiant with enthusiasm. "I have been promoted by the organization. This implies that..." He halted, his eyes gleaming. "We are relocating to the metropolis." I was paralyzed. Relocate. Absent. Keep away from this residence. I departed from the location where I had experienced such profound loneliness that it was devoid of life. However, it was in this location that I experienced an emotion that I had never experienced before. I was uncertain as to whether to experience relief or anguish. I inadvertently observed William. He did not respond. He continued to consume food without interruption, as if he had been aware of this information from the beginning, as if he had always anticipated that I would eventually depart. Ultimately, the day of the relocation came. I remained on the veranda, observing the vehicle as it prepared to depart. Daniel was preoccupied with inspecting the furnishings. I turned around to take one final glance at the house. William was situated on the doorway. Both of us gazed at one another. Neither of us bid each other farewell, because we both recognize that certain farewells are unnecessary. Certain objects will endure in the mind indefinitely regardless of their intangibility. I grinned, a smile that is as light as the breeze. I then retreated. I entered the vehicle. That residence. That individual. All the emotions that have yet to be identified. They will perpetually remain in this location. Confidential. A memory. An entity that will never vanish. I will always remember it, regardless of how far I travel in the remainder of my life. And occasionally, I will contemplate the consequences of my absence. Like what you heard. There's plenty more heartbreak and secrets to come. Hit like, subscribe, and stay curious with Tangled Truths.